Early on, we're playing 5-10 no limit Texas Hold'em in for $1,500. Early on in the session, there was two games. I was in the must move game, and this first hand is very early on in the poker session. We see an early position limp before the hijack raises it up to $50. Cutoff folds, and we look down at a premium hand, the second best hand ever created, in fact, pocket kings. Definitely gonna 3-bet this and make it $160 to go. The blinds fold, the limper folds, and it's back on the player who put in that initial raise, the hijack. He decides $160 still isn't enough money. He puts in a 4-bet. 4-bets it up to $400 even. So a little bit of a decision here. Debate between flat calling, keep his range wide, or 5-bet. 5-bet jamming probably, considering the fact that we are 1,000, I think 300-ish, 1,300 effective here. I think 5-bet uncaps my range a little bit. I think if we flat call here, then we generally have a pretty strong hand. I mean, the only hands that I'm really gonna have here, queens plus ace king, maybe ace queen suited, but probably maybe. I guess ace queen suited is also in that range, possibly. I think if we go ahead and put in a 5-bet jam, I think we can maybe have a few more bluffs in my range, according to him. Can also maybe be a little bit lighter. We can have a hand like ace queen. Probably rather jam that hand as opposed to just flat calling. We can also get into a little bit of a leveling war here with the hijack player, because remember the player from early position limped in, and then that player in the hijack can often be isolation raising, and then I can view that raise as such, as an isolation raise, and I can put in the 3-bet to try and take advantage of that. He can then go to the next level and put in the 4-bets to take advantage of my raise. So I think going to the next level, putting in the 5-bet, if that ever happens, makes some sense. But we have ourselves pocket kings. We don't really want to flat call as often as we would with, say, pocket aces, because there will be some flops where we're not exactly sure what is going on, where we're at. If that flop comes ace high, we're not going to be loving it. So all that talk adds up to a 5-bet jam. I decided to go ahead and rip it in there. It's 1.3K effective. My opponent does not snap call, so that's good news. We do not have a cooler situation on our hands versus the pocket aces, but my opponent does decide on a call. So we are going to see all 5 cards. Nobody asks if we want to run it once or twice, and I usually am not the one to bring it up. I just kind of let my opponent decide what he wants to do, but I'm not really going to bring up the question. So looks like we're off to see 5 cards one time. Flop is not great. Flop comes down ace high, and these pocket kings do not see any further improvement on the turn or the river. I show it down since I was the aggressor, and my opponent shows us ace-10 offsuit. Yeah, a non-believing ace-10 offsuit does the job, cracks the pocket kings, and a little bit frustrating, a little bit disappointing to start the session off. Down $1,300, not a great feeling, especially right off the bat. Always have good hopes of booking a win, making some money, getting out there on the grind, and then to get a huge hand cracked immediately down into the hole for $1,300. Not ideal. Okay, we're gonna try and shake it off here. Shortly after that, that same player in the hijack raises it up to $40 a couple orbits later. The cutoff calls this time, and it looks like we've upgraded, the only upgrade possible from those pocket kings up to the best hand ever created, pocket aces. Right, so my standard play here is to make it 4 times the initial raise, considering there is a caller in between me and the initial raiser, so I make it $160 to go. Folds back around to the hijack, who flat calls this time. No pre-flop shenanigans apparently, and the cutoff decides on a fold. So once again, going heads up to the flop, which comes down 10-9-3 with 2 spades. First player checks. Definitely want to c-bet here. I don't think there's any reason to down bet it either, so I go ahead and make it $170 to go. Should be able to get some value from some different drawing hands, some over pairs, some top pairs, maybe even some non-believing middle pairs. We do in fact see a call. We're off to a turn card which pairs the 10. So not exactly super ideal. We're losing to some 10s that could be in my opponent's range. And what's interesting is that my opponent leads out for $200 this time. For that size, for that price, definitely not gonna go anywhere. Definitely have a little bit of concern, but plenty of other hands that my opponent could have in his range, such as all those aforementioned drawing hands. So for that price, easy call. River's a total break, offsuit deuce. My opponent leads out again, this time for $300. The size of this bet compared to the size of this pot, we have a very straightforward call here. Raising I don't think makes too much sense, considering that my opponent will often have a 10, some draws, and then I don't know what else. If he has a 10, we just lose more money, and if he has draws, busted draws, bluffs, then we don't get any value from those hands anyway. So I think we have a pretty straightforward call here, and my opponent shows us pocket jacks. Okay, we'll take it. Scoop in these chips. Good to get a little bit of a get back from the Pocket Kings disaster. Pocket Aces, a little bit more durable than the Pocket Kings apparently, and we will happily scoop it in, trending in the better direction. All right, we're gonna fast forward to a decent while later in this game. The Bellagio, they got maximum of 3 games this night on a Wednesday night. There was 1 must move, then there became a second must move, then there became 2 main tables and 1 must move, and at this point we are back on the original table that we started at, which is now a main game. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. What does matter is that there's an under the gun raise to $30, and we were playing, I think, 6-handed, so kind of short-handed. We looked down at King, Queen of Diamonds next to act. There are some situations where I think a 3-bet would definitely be in order, but versus a solid player, I'm under the gun, flat call makes a lot of sense. The player on my left agrees, he makes the call, and everyone else folds. So, 3 of us going to a very favorable flop for the King, Queen of Diamonds. Comes down ace high, all diamonds. That means we flop the nuts. The initial raiser bet's $40, could raise, could flat call. I'm a little bit more familiar with the under the gun player than I am with the player on my left. At this point, as I'm playing with that player, I'm not super familiar with him, but later on I would become more familiar with him. And in fact, he wanted me to address him as Border Patrol officer who's having himself a grand old time, having several beverages here at the table, here in Las Vegas, having himself a nice week, a nice getaway. Anyway, he decides $40, not enough money. Min raise, $80. Initial raiser decides that's way too much money. Too rich for his blood, and he gets out of the way. So now it's back to us, and I don't think that I really need to balance in this spot. And I say that because I do decide to put in a raise and put some more money in here and make it $250 to go. And I'm never gonna really have too many bluffs here. I just think that the player on my left is gonna be stronger than average, usually. I think he's gonna have himself some top pairs. He's gonna have himself some worse flushes, and maybe the occasional 2-pair or set type of a hand. I think we all have different definitions of strong hands, and I think when he puts in a raise on this flop, I think he likes his hand. So all that adds up to me wanting to put in more money on this flop. $250 to go in a very unbalanced manner, and my opponent asks how much that is before making the call. I get distracted by this view out here as I'm thinking about these poker hands. I mean, look at this view. The view is amazing. Really, like, look at this. Look at this. This is what I'm looking at while I'm trying to relay these poker hands to you. Just stunning. Okay, where was I? So, player on my left makes the call, and we are heads up to a turn card, which is not super ideal. It's another 6, pairs the board. That's the only sort of card we did not want to see, but that's not going to stop me from putting in more money here on the turn at the very least. I bet $300 this time. My opponent asks how much is that wager before deciding to put the rest of his stack in there. It's about $1,000 effective. So again, not the most ideal turn card. We no longer have the nuts. Maybe a little bit of cause for concern, but in the end, it's really not gonna matter. We're never gonna get away from this hand, no matter what is going on, no matter what my read or my gut or ranges or any of that stuff might say. I toss it in. Let's see one more card, please, dealer. That card is inconsequential, especially when my opponent shows us pocket 6s. So, sure, there could be an argument to be made for trying to find a fold after he decides to jam all the money in there on the turn, but flop the nuts. It does suck that we're blocking the second nuts. We would, of course, prefer to have a hand like King Jack or King 10 of diamonds, which would unlock the Queen high flush or the Jack high flush. Surprisingly, there's a lot of action to be found on a Wednesday evening in this 5-10 game at the Bellagio. So it just wasn't going to happen. We were never going to be able to get away from that. A little bit of a cooler. All right, still the same table, but there has been a couple of players that have joined us, so we are closer to full ring now. And there's a straddle that has been on and off a little bit. In this case, it is on, thanks to yours truly. I put on the straddle. The same player on my left, he goes ahead and raises it up to $40, so another min raise. And we see 3 callers before we look down at King Jack suited in the straddle. You have to imagine that all of those callers cannot be too strong, because if they had much of anything facing that min open, certainly they would be pretty incentivized to put in a 3-bet and discourage players behind them coming in, as well as just trying to straight up get value for their hands. So I think this makes a pretty good candidate for a 3-bet squeeze. We have blockers to some strong hands such as pocket kings, ace king, king queen suited, pocket jacks. And in the instances when we do get called, then we have ourselves a pretty playable hand here. Suited Broadway cards should fare okay. I raise it up to $200, which I think maybe is a little bit on the small side. We probably want to go 4x the original raise plus 1x for the callers, something along those lines. So we could raise anywhere from $240 up to maybe $300. I think 200 is a little bit on the small side. 200 it is in the moment though, and we see a fold from the initial raiser, which is usually a pretty good sign because often that is the main player that we're worried about. We see two other folds, but the small blind does make the call. So we are going to take this one to the streets. Heads up, and we see a flop of queen, 4, deuce, rainbow. My opponent checks it. This time I think a down bet might make a little bit of sense. It's a pretty dry flop that should not have connected with my opponent too often. He could have pocket 4s, he could have pocket deuces, but he's probably not gonna have pocket queens, and he shouldn't really have any of these two pair combinations that are available on this flop. I bet $180, and my opponent, he's not done with the hand yet. He decides he wants to stick around and he makes the call. Turn is a pretty interesting card. It's the 9 of spades, which puts up a second spade. My opponent checks it over to me, and now we have a decision. I think my opponent has somewhere around $1,100 in the spot on this turn. So it's a matter of probably jamming all in or checking back and trying to realize some equity here. If the 9 was the 9 of clubs, I think we would have a very straightforward jam on our hands here. It would be a little bit of an overbet, but not a massive overbet jam. I think that would make perfect sense. As it is, I'm not sure if the 9 of spades is enough added equity to go ahead and rip it in there, but we should be pretty uncapped here. We're still gonna have all the best hands such as aces, kings, pocket queens. I guess ace queen might be somewhat even. I think my opponent is gonna have a lot of middling pair type hands, maybe hands like pocket 10s, maybe pocket 8s. So hands like that are gonna be put in a pretty tough spot with a jam. Granted, he could hero us off. He could just put us on the ace king type hand and you know, snap it off. So I don't know. I'm a little bit conflicted. I think for a very long time going to the tank, but eventually I decided to check it back, take the conservative route, and try to realize some equity here. And that equity is very much realized on an offsuit 10 river card. So your buddy here, Andrew, running good as usual, finding the magic card on the river. We do not see a bet from my opponent. He checks it over to us, and now it's just a matter of finding a value size here to try and extract from my opponent. Still could go ahead and jam and hope that my opponent tries to hero us off, but I decide on a slightly more value-y proposition. I bet $620. My opponent, once again, does not do anything quickly, goes deep into the tank, so much so that one of the other players ends up calling the clock on him, thinking for so long. He gets maybe about halfway through the clock before making his decision. That decision ends up being a call. So obviously great news. That definitely helps us out in this situation, in this this session overall. We win a couple of smaller pots along the way, and we end up booking a win in this session.